I've been charged with posing some questions to the panelists. They've presented to us two very different cases. That is, the Turkish case is far more drastic than the Hungarian case. You don't have thousands of academics and professors being fired and arrested in Hungary, as Jason just explained. But however, you do see in both places illiberal regimes that are departing from the norms of liberal democracy. And it seems that things have been getting worse in both places in recent months, and with particular focus on higher education. Internationally, you know that universities sometimes are sources of protest, political protest. If you think of the year 1968 or 1956 in Eastern Europe, 1989, there have been a number of times in history when universities, students in particular, have produced protest against political regimes, particularly authoritarian regimes. But perhaps in many more cases, universities actually are sources of political support. You might even say that they're resources of conformity. They produce, they use conformist professors to produce conformist students, to produce a conformist bureaucracy. That's the ideal case, for example, in Nazi Germany. So with those facts in mind, I want to pose a few questions to both panelists. And one would be, to both Brendan and Jason, are universities, generally speaking, supportive of these regimes or not? I mean, we've learned from Brendan that a lot of professors and students are in jail, but you know, what I'm not clear about is whether 69,000 students is a huge chunk of the student body or a rather small sliver. Are universities more a problem or more a resource and a support for the regime? And the same would go to you, Jason. It seems you actually touched on this briefly, but CEU is a very unusual place. It's mostly a foreign student body, largely foreign faculty. What about higher education in general? And then please explain why. So why are universities either sources of protest and criticism or sources of support? Or if the picture is mixed, please explain how and why. So, Brendan.
Well, I couldn't say with authority on how that, I couldn't really answer with authority on that question in terms of how supportive they are of the government, but I have had individual cases of where certain factions within universities, certain universities support the government and are prepared to name people they think are supporting other elements, and then they get drawn into this and taken away. And in other cases where individual professors, Sadat Lashin is one of them, where once a different rector he was a rector of a university, once a different rector was a rival was installed in the university by the government, even though he had won the election. He was then banished to an outpost, and then he was named as one of the people who'd been involved in the Gulenist movement, even though he hasn't. So there may be people settling scores, there may be rivalries being played out, as well as the share of the political support going on.
Do you know whether their institutions supported them when they were subjected to these repressive measures?
I don't know, actually. I don't have enough information on that.
Okay.
The information we've had is mainly on individual cases rather than...
So your organization plays the role of a sort of a human rights watch and traces cases of severe abuse.
We do have an academic freedom section, and we make a point of tracking cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Jason?
So we have to distinguish, first of all, between the Central European University and the other universities. And so the Central European, as I said, is quite opposed. But you're quite right that the faculty is largely, although not completely, drawn from countries outside of Hungary, as is the student body. So it was meant to be a place where people from all over the post-communist world come to learn about liberalism and democracy. That was the original idea behind setting it up. So there's, needless to say, deep opposition. As far as the other universities are concerned, I think it's pretty much a mixed bag. I noted that, so there are conservatives in Hungary that do not support the government. So the two are not coterminous. Fidesz has actually, as Fidesz has become more authoritarian and more opposed to liberalism over time, some conservatives and others are peeling away their support. And I don't want to mention names, but I know this to be true. They still are basically conservative and not liberal, but they don't support the authoritarian tendencies of the party. And basically the view is this is not why we had 1989. We didn't bring about the end of communism in order to reintroduce a new form of authoritarianism. And so, in other words, Fidesz is going too far. The student body, as I noted, on the whole is quite conservative. So they may oppose the government for entirely different reasons, not because they want to restore liberalism, but they think that they want a fuller revolution, a fuller political revolution. So these would be the supporters of Jobbik. So I think it's very hard to make generalizations.
Okay. Well, I'll still ask you to try to make maybe one or two. In both cases, have you noticed any particular faculties, that is, at the universities that have been more involved than others in protest? For example, among the people subject to arrest and abuse, have they been law professors? Have they tended to be humanities professors? Could you say anything about that?
Well, I haven't, I only what's the word, individual cases. I couldn't tell you a trend on that. I'd have to do some research to find that out. But certainly political scientists have been targeted. But I get the impression that it's more widespread than that. And certainly some some universities, whole universities have been closed down. And I think that's as far as I'd like to go on that.
Whole universities have been closed down for a significant time? Are they reopened? Or are they?
No, they're closed. Ones that are funded by or linked to Gulenist movement.
And they've just been closed for good?
Closed for good, yeah. Affected 60,000, I think it was 60,000 students. Lost their...
Do you have any sense of what the plans are for those universities? Are they going to take them over and retool them?
I haven't heard anything on that.
Okay.
That they are... Sorry, I mean, some of the questions you're asking, like, do people support... anyone who is the current atmosphere in Turkey, anyone who voices any opposition is immediately putting themselves at risk.
Right.
So that's an added difficulty to obtaining information.
Right. Okay. Jason, do you have any?
So this is, yet another one of the ironies of the difference between the Erdogan and the Orban strategies is by throwing people out of their jobs, people have nothing to lose by protesting. In Hungary, on the other hand, people have a lot to lose because the government isn't throwing them in jail, but it is threatening their livelihood. And so the people are forced into the situation where, do I want to lose my job and make myself, I'm a 50-something academic, how do I feed my family? And that tends to dampen the level of protest on the faculty side. Now, I will say that the more quiescent faculties are the STEM faculties. Mm-hmm. Which was true historically. It was true in the 1930s and the 1940s, where people were pursuing, I'm a scientist and I'm going to pursue mine, everything else, I don't agree and I don't disagree. I want to do my work. So you tend to hear, on the whole, you tend to hear very little. Where there's small amounts of discomfort, it tends to come from the humanities and social sciences. So again, very similar, actually not too dissimilar from the US situation.
And as I recall, there were also moments of protest by other universities in favor of Central European University that actually people took to the streets. Do we know much about those?
I don't know much about those.
Okay.
I think they were small in comparison to the liberal protests that were going on against Fidesz, which involved tens of thousands of people.
Well, I think, for those in the audience may not know this, I was reminded actually kindly from a guest from Moscow that I actually edited a book on universities under dictatorship. This is about 15 or 16 years ago. And what we saw across many cases, fascist Italy, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Nazi Germany, was that all of these regimes had a long-term strategy as to how to make universities supportive and useful, focusing usually on students as well as junior faculty. Junior faculty tended, for example, to be very supportive of the Nazi regime in the 1930s. But there were people in ministerial posts and party posts who had very specific ideas about what they were doing. But what I'm hearing from Jason and Brendan, it seems that the regimes that we're talking about in Hungary and Turkey probably don't have that kind of long-term strategy. Does either of you know anything in that regard? I'm guessing it's too early to say, but...
Well, one thing to that they've done in Turkey is that one of the instruments of government influence over the universities is the Council of Higher Education, which has been used in a political way historically, first of all to reinforce the secular nature of the Republic through particularly what was a very controversial issue, the issue of whether students could wear headscarves. And those people have been replaced with pro-Erdogan supporters.
So they're using the existing institution but for their own political purposes, which is in some ways the opposite. Is it now safe to wear headscarves at universities?
Yes.
It is, right. But there are other kinds of political control taking place other than just suppression of criticism? Is there, as far as you know, are there active attempts to promote a kind of message at the humanities faculties or in literature?
I don't know about that, but one of the problems, one of the very significant problems is that the hundreds of media outlets have been closed down. Any outlet that's critical of the government is at risk. Any outlet that is perceived as slightly associated with Gulenism has been closed down, and that makes it very difficult to find any information. Information that is published, it's difficult for people to take the risk of publishing information that is critical.
And do you know whether the regime has taken control of textbook publishing and things like that, so that it can actually mass produce its own message through history classes, for example?
I haven't heard anything on that.
Okay. Jason, do you have any insights in that?
Well, they definitely have an agenda. Now, I think they're not acting strategically in certain ways, but they have an agenda. Fidesz, or the prime minister, and maybe Fidesz more broadly, they don't like liberalism, and he's open about it. He sees the liberal period, which lasted from 1990 until basically 2009 or 2010, as having not served Hungarian national interests well. And so the regime explicitly builds itself as a regime which will strengthen the Hungarian nation in order to help it compete better with other nations. So this is the viewpoint, and that's where Turkey, that's where Erdogan comes in, and a handful of other. Putin, for example, also comes in for praise for standing up for Russian national interests in their eyes. Now, I think that their attack on higher education, and the CEU in particular, is a mistake, because the way they should be thinking in order to accomplish those goals is to leave CEU alone, because by having CEU alone there, it essentially allows them to dismiss any criticism that they're trying to squelch liberal opinion, because, well, here's an extremely liberal university. They win because CEU is basically harmless, because most of the student body are not Hungarian and most of the faculty are not Hungarian. And so in concrete terms, it actually doesn't pose a threat to the regime in any way whatsoever, but at the same time would allow them to dismiss criticisms that they're becoming exceedingly authoritarian. Obviously, they didn't employ me as an advisor, otherwise I would have advised them to take their hands off.
Thank you. I think it's time for us to open it up to the audience. So would you please, if you have questions, there's a microphone going around. Would you please pose them? And
so, the scale of what's going on in Turkey seems, just gigantic. And I don't know, maybe we could match it to the kind of thing that was going on in the Cultural Revolution or not, I don't know. But we don't really, and also in the midst of this, it seems that the international community is perhaps compromised, overwhelmed with problems, and Turkey being an ally. But have we seen any kind of interest or action, or should there be interest or action by the international community in regards to, I realize it's a broad-based purge, but academics is a very, it's a very serious targeted group. Is there any movement in that area, or you think that it should be?
What's interesting is there has been a lot of international support from international academics. Chomsky signed the petition. When they were arrested, a lot of international academics signed up, and the group Concerned Scientists got behind it, and Scholars at Risk, and a whole long list of international human rights and academic organizations got behind on the issue of the academic petition, and have kept raising issues of individual cases. But there's been, what you've raised is really an important question. There's been very little international response from governments that I've seen. I haven't seen anything, actually, raising this issue. And I don't know if they're tiptoeing around Erdogan because he's an important ally, and he's a crucial ally for Europe now because of the refugee deal that they did. He was always crucial in NATO because he's a crucial link in the chain in Southeast Europe, as it was for containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He's a spiky character, and it's a strong country now, relatively, compared to what it was when it was before Erdogan. It was riddled with weak governments that collapsed regularly, and he's actually been quite a successful leader in Turkish terms. So, but yes, there hasn't been an international criticism that I know from governments.
Jason, do you want to say something?
No.
Okay, other?
Take another question.
Isaac from HEC University Moscow. I was kind of puzzled by the comment that the majority of Hungarian students, maybe at least...
It's an exaggeration, but...
Yeah, but significant
many.
part of
Yeah.
Hungarian students are conservative, or in terms that we use here at this conference, they support this new nationalism. Maybe it means that we have to have kind of neutral research view on that, and we need to understand why students have these views and what provokes this nationalism. John mentioned his book, and I do remember Martin Heidegger's lecture on new ideal of German university, something like that, and Heidegger explicitly mentioned the trauma of German nation, etc., etc. Maybe Hungarian students feel the same, and then why?
Okay. So, I mean, your support. First of all, we need to distinguish between liberalism and nationalism. So what Fidesz is really about is being against liberalism. The nationalism part is there, but it's less well formed. But the anti-liberalism is explicit. And if you look in sort of macroeconomic terms, there's no particular reason that Hungarians, and not just young people, but it's a very popular party even among non-students. There's no reason as such in macroeconomic terms for Hungarians to be as pessimistic as they were about the old system and as supportive as they are about Fidesz, which explicitly pledges to wipe out the old liberal state. The economy wasn't so bad. I mean, they just weren't, compared to the Soviet Union, compared to Russia or the former Soviet republics outside of the Baltic states, Hungary would be a paradise in macroeconomic terms. So that begs the question of why. And I think that the government has been stoking nationalism. Hungary had a birth trauma, the trauma of the birth of the country, in which the country was much smaller than it had been before. And this is a constant siren call. And it's always been popular. Trianon, sorry. So one of the post-World War I peace treaties that settled World War I. We know about Versailles, we know about others, but it's the Trianon one that dealt with that particular area. And this has been constantly stoked, indeed, for the past 100 years. It's always been there at a low level, and sometimes the government heats it up. Now, Fidesz is, in many ways, is trying to stoke this as a way of stoking nationalism. For example, by pledging support for ethnic Hungarians that live in the Habsburg successor states. In a way, it's a parallel to the Soviet, the post-Soviet Russian case, where you have the Russians also in their near abroad. He's doing that. The government is also trying to change people's view of the 20th century through textbooks and museums and so on and so forth, to essentially make communism the equivalent of fascism as an equally evil regime worthy of castigation. to wash over the differences between them. And so I don't really have a concrete answer as to why the young people are so attracted to it, except for the fact that they're getting these messages from various sources. And these are not people with a lot of social and political capital, so they tend not to speak foreign languages. And so they're not in a position to benefit as others do from this from the formerly liberal state of affairs.
Other questions? Yes.
My name is Kirsan Song from Chinese University. I'm a visiting scholar of Graduate School of Education, UC Berkeley. When I listen about that, just John talked about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and that is 10 years kind of, just they closed the university. And there's no students, all the students, faculty member go to the farm, go to the kind of countryside to become a farm or factory work laborers. That for them, Chinese scholars, they are very ashamed about that, how the government treat the intelligent and university. There's no function of a university. So when you listen about the Turkey and Hungary issue, I wonder how to define the people, their own national universities. Because the government take down and put them to the jail, and then the students are kind of, that kind of, there's nothing to talk about any kind of their voice in Turkey, for example. Then my question is, that country from the historical perspective, how they define the university as their value in their own country? Because this is kind of, for me, is a very fundamental question about how they believe of their university. Because this has happened, is directly controlled by a political issue, and the government have done that way. So that is time wonder, because in China happened, and then they shame about that, this situation. So I just wonder what is their hope about the Turkish universities? People believe, and what is they want to be changed, because politics always supported by people, and then policy always kind of the politician always have to listen how the people movement, that is the social movement, to bring in the policy reform.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah.
Do you have any thoughts?
I don't think I couldn't really answer that question, but I think in the Turkish case, I think we need to understand that a lot of people, maybe most people in Turkey, see the coup attempt as a threat to their country, which it was. I mean, it was an attempt to overthrow the government, and a lot of people, we've had comments from academics who believe that the Gulenists were trying to overtake the country, and that it's right to move against them. So opinion, is divided, and actually, Erdogan is very popular. And you may find that actually most people agree with him on that. So, it's a difficult situation.
I want to maybe answer it in the question in a slightly different way. So, I would say that in general, Hungary is a small country, 10 million, roughly 10 million people, and because of that, they actually worship some of their most prominent intellectuals. So it's poets and writers and scientists, extremely proud of the many people winning a Nobel Prize, very good in STEM, and they're all aware of all of this. And so it's not so much that the people don't support attacks against intellectuals. So no sacred cow, if you will, has come under fire in this attack on the university. So it's really more about the institutions, it seems, more than individuals. So I think in this sense, a cultural revolution could not, in the Chinese sense, where the intellectuals were literally sent off to work in the countryside, there would be no support whatsoever in any part of the political spectrum for this in Hungary, because these are their pride is their contributions to world science and world literature.
I can maybe add a word about Poland, which we haven't talked about, but is also suffering the consequences of an illiberal regime currently. And if that regime has not moved against universities, but if it were to do that, it would immediately remind people, first of the Stalinists, but even in some ways, more distressingly, of what happened between 1939 and 1945. Among the first acts of the Nazi occupiers during the war was to close the universities and arrest professors. So any regime that, even the Stalinist regime after the war was cognizant of that, and I think the history itself tended to restrain acts against intellectual freedom because of the fear of awakening those associations with World War II, and indeed the entire 20th century has been, in some ways, and previous times have been battles for culture and higher education. So that's maybe a somewhat I don't know, overly optimistic. Maybe on the background of history, it's tough to repeat that history.
That's